Good morning, everybody. This morning, we're going to cover a topic that was ripped from the headlines last week. And was, as you can see from source number one, it's from a news outlet called Borough Park 24. It's a Jewish news outlet. This really did not make it into the secular press, but it was part of a daily news digest that I get every day as an email. And the headline was, Mayor Adams completes the Brooklyn Eruv project by signing a 99-year lease for $1. And this got me thinking about some of the laws of the Eruv. I would imagine many of us probably barely ever think twice about carrying on Shabbos because of the fact that we have the Eruv creating an enclosure. And take a look at the news report. You see there a picture of the proclamation. That's a little bit hard to read in the image. You can enlarge it. But essentially, a new Eruv surrounds all of Borough Park and most of Brooklyn, thanks to the work of the Brooklyn Eruv Board and Vod. While many smaller kosher Eruvim have long served many Jewish communities in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Eruv, which has extended the boundaries of most of the Eruvim, covers many areas previously included in any Eruv that can serve as a backup when other Eruvim go down. Well, the first part of completing an Eruv is building and repairing the Eruv's Tzuras HaPesachim, or the doors and virtual walls. The second part is that the city's mayor or police commissioner must rent the Eruv to the Jewish community. While in the past, the city had given a Jewish community a verbal agreement, today, at City Hall, Mayor Eric Adams completed the project by signing a 99-year lease for $1 to allow carrying in the boundaries of the Eruv in accordance with Jewish law. The mayor signed proclamation said. And there were a whole bunch of pictures on the website, including one with the dollar bill, paperclip to the document. And so essentially, there's an Eruv. I think, as I mentioned, Eruvin have been taken for granted. I remember growing up in New Haven, Connecticut in the 1980s. And until I was 12 or 13 years old, there was no Eruv. So there was the key under the doormat. There was the tie clip key. There was the connected to a watch, made a piece of jewelry. Right, there are all sorts of different mechanisms if you didn't want to leave your door unlocked, which in some quieter places that's certainly a possibility. But starting in when I was 12 or 13, the Eruv went up. All right, there was a boundary, and we all lived within that boundary, and we didn't really think too much of it. There was the suggestion or the guidance that you call to make sure that the Eruv is up, and that's just become taken for granted. Certainly, my kids have grown up essentially in places where there's always an Eruv. I think sometimes when we went away on vacation, there was no Eruv, and then you had to find creative solutions for how do you move the kids around, or how do you get the diapers to shul, and all these types of different things. But for the most part, we've become an Eruv acculturated Orthodox community. And so this article describes a situation, a part of the Eruv process, which is fairly less well known. And I thought we'd explain it in greater detail, but also talk a little bit about how an Eruv works. We know there is an Eruv. Usually we just assume that it is up unless told otherwise. It can become very traumatic for an Eruv to be down for Shabbos and for people to come to shul and then find out that they have the things that they need in their pockets and can't carry. And there are all sorts of different situations. We'll talk about a few of them, but just like we learn in social studies class in elementary school, how a bill becomes a law. How does the Eruv work? So first, I want to point out a misnomer. Right, when we talk about the word Eruv, Eruv literally means combination. So when we talk about is the Eruv up, we're usually asking whether the boundaries that turn essentially a public domain into a private domain, whether that's up or not. And that's actually not what the word Eruv is referring to. So the article made mention of the doors and virtual walls, right? And that's the idea that essentially the Torah says that you're not allowed to move around, you're not allowed to carry around outside on Shabbos, the public domain. So the question is, what is a public domain? The Torah may have a very specific idea of the public domain, referencing the encampment to the Jewish people in the desert. But usually when we talk about a biblical public domain, it has to be a very big unenclosed space with a certain number of people, with potentially certain width of streets, and a road that goes from end to end in the public domain. That we call is the reference as Rishus Harabim, public domain, or a biblical public domain. Now, that can be very complicated and may require enclosing with a wall. So for the most part, most places, most cities, most neighborhoods aren't considered biblical public domains according to all the opinions. And so they can be enclosed, not necessarily with physical walls, but with other types. Most commonly, people think of when it comes to an Eruv are telephone poles and wires. So really the official term for this is Tzurat HaPesach, which means it looks like a door. So it has, two vertical poles and something going across the top, a third pole or a wire. And the idea is that the telephone poles and telephone wires can help us create those doors or virtual walls. And that's one mechanism. The other is the idea that if you have a very steep incline that inclines, let's say, about 3.5 feet in a very short period of time. So like you have to kind of imagine a steep hill, then that could also, that type of a incline can help, think about sometimes if you're going into, if you're riding on the train and, above you, you see like the neighborhood. Think about like if anyone's taken the LIRR into Penn Station, you're in a train yard and there's a big incline. In a sense, that incline can help serve as an Eruv, assuming you want to walk on the train tracks. You're not going to, but these types of things, but it could also serve as a part of a boundary around the area where the train tracks are. So these are the types of enclosures. And usually when it talks about telephone poles, it's not the telephone poles themselves. Usually attached to the telephone pole is a small strip of a separate miniature or seemingly smaller pole, and the pole goes directly up underneath the wire, because usually telephone poles don't have wires right on top of them. So in order to create that virtual doorway or wall, you have to have the vertical and the horizontal directly over the vertical. Technically, it doesn't have to touch. The vertical can be beneath the horizontal, similar to the walls of a sukkah. There are a lot of similar rules. In fact, the Talmud says that the certain rules of sukkah and Eruv are all coming from the same discussion that took place when these laws were presented at Sinai. So usually we take this place that's not fully a public domain in the biblical sense, and we find a way of enclosing it. And if it's not already enclosed, then we build some of these additional add-on structures and we turn that public space into private space. But just because it's enclosed doesn't mean that you can carry it. And that's where the Eruv comes in, because as you see with source number 2, a courtyard with many houses that open up into it, the rabbis prohibited carrying from house to house until they create an Eruv in which they have collected bread from each household and placed it in one of the houses in the courtyard. With this method, we see that if all citizens of the courtyard are living in one house and the entire courtyard is designated to that one house. The Eruv literally means to join. And the idea is if you have an enclosed space, right, what was described in source number 2, which is described in the Talmud, quote in the Code of Jewish Law, is that even if you have like an enclosed courtyard with lots of houses opening into it, you still can't carry until you find a way of uniting all of those homes into one essential property, or create one home out of the many. And you have to have an Eruv, and that Eruv is you have a communal meal, something that will serve as a way of uniting everyone in that private enclosed space. And so you have to take, as it says, something that will, you have to take bread from each of the houses, and it's held in one place. And so basically you're uniting everybody in that the homes in that courtyard, and creating a kind of shared space. Well, you have to do the same thing in an area that's enclosed by our Eruv. So think of wherever you are living, whether you're, in a large community or small community, a village or, a city, you have to be able to properly enclose, and then you have to find a way of joining everyone together with a communal meal, And that communal meal is called the Eruv. Now, you might be thinking, what kind of communal meal, is there? Is it like kind of like potluck that each week someone's got the pot, someone's got the cholent that you can taste? So the way the Shulchan Aruch describes it is that you have a way of everyone somehow contributes, and you have that as they're participating. So when was the last time you were asked on a Friday to participate in this? You're not, because essentially what is done is that see source number 4 in the Code of Jewish Law, that if one person, this is the Hebrew, we'll translate into the English, one person in the area is able to take the bread and create the meal on behalf of everybody. And as long as he takes that meal and gives it to someone and says essentially on behalf of everyone, I'm assigning this as the communal meal, that's all it takes. So what kind of food? People have different likes and menu requirements. So usually what is taken is bread, and so this would have to be done every week, but then it could get forgotten. And then if you don't have this communal meal every week, then you can't carry it. So what is generally done is that in the area, matzah is taken, and matzah is a box of matzah is assigned for the area of the Eruv, and usually someone in the community, usually it's the rabbi, will every year designate, here is the communal meal, and this is going to be held, and everyone has access to it if they want it. Now, most people, have better things on their menu than just the box of matzah, and won't partake in it. But if someone really needs it or wants it, they have this at their disposal. And where is it? So the Ramah points out in source number 3, Minhag bizman hazel haniach eruv beveit hakneset. You put it in the shul. V'chenagu hakodmonim, and this is what they did for many generations. And it seems that we're creating a kind of a partnership. It doesn't have to be in a house. It could be in a place that's accessible to all. So anyone who's ever hungry on Shabbos and wants to participate in the box of matzah that has been designated as the Eruv for Atlantic Beach, you're more than welcome. I can't speak for how long it stays fresh. The last time matzahs, it's traditionally been done that it's replaced every year before Pesach. So everyone is welcome to do that. But when you talk about an Eruv, according to the Talmud, according to the sources, according to Halacha, the Eruv is actually that meal, that box of matzah. So when you say is the Eruv up, it actually doesn't really make any sense. The Eruv has either been designated or not, but common parlance has been to say the Eruv is whether the wires are up and whether the place is actually enclosed, and it doesn't generally speak about that box of matzah. But officially, and I still remember learning this from Rabbi Herschel Schachter Yeshiva University. He was the one who points out that if you want to be accurate, Eruv is the box of matzah. Eruv is the communal meal that everyone has access to, that unites everybody together, because it's not only about enclosure, it's about joining everybody together. We'll have to now talk about how exactly this works. Did anybody ask if you want to join? Let's say you want to exclude yourself. But let's just stop and take any questions or comments on the introduction of the terms, the Eruv, public domain, private domain, joining together all the private domains to create a halachic enclosure for people to carry.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
This discussion generally is about important events. And I just want to briefly state that for me, a very important event this past week was Netanyahu declaring that Trump was a felon. I was glad to hear that from a reliable source.
I must have missed that. You'll have to send me the source, but okay.
Just Google it. He denounced Trump
I don't believe it. You can't believe everything you see on Google.
For dinner. That's very obvious.
All right. I guess the only thing connecting to an Eruv in that is that a meal is something that works for the Eruv. I guess technically it would have to be kosher meal. That's why stick with matzah. Everybody eats bread. Bread is not going to stay fresh for an entire year. Stick with the matzah. It has a longer shelf life. So when we carry on Shabbos, we're relying on the fact that the area we live in is able to be enclosed, is enclosed properly, and everybody is joining together. But the question is, how does that work in terms of, who's part of the community? How exactly is this working? Does everyone have to be informed, right? Since when do we join everyone together without asking them? And there are also a number of detailed laws regarding, who is taking the initiative on this. Is it only observant people? Let's say there are Jews in the community who don't care about an Eruv. Like, how does this work to create a unified whole if you don't really have full buy-in, right? We could just say, well, that's the law and we do it anyway, but that's generally not how halacha works. Jewish law works by having very specific categories. So if it's a biblical public domain, then you're gonna have a problem ever enclosing it, right? If you, in larger cities throughout history, this was always the question. Places like Warsaw, places like Paris in the 1900s, as they became big cities that were larger than anything that people have encountered before, how do you enclose them if you don't have walls? Once upon a time, all cities had walls, and they would open them in the day and close them at the night, and that's how people stayed safe. But as you end up with these sprawling metropolises, how do you ever enclose them? Or, in particular in this country, New York City was always posed a problem. Isn't New York City big enough? Right? Sir, how do you enclose a place like New York City? And there have been opposition to some neighborhoods. We started off by talking about an Eruv in Borough Park in Brooklyn. There has been numerous discussions throughout over the last 100 years as people became more careful about wanting to have an Eruv. Once upon a time, it wasn't a big deal. So what? The wife and kids are stuck at home for Shabbos. No one's going to mind. But as things have developed and the concept of an Eruv became more and more feasible, especially as Jews were becoming more active in getting involved in the community and moving beyond, taking their steps outside of the small neighborhoods to try and, assert themselves in the community, the creation of an Eruv became more possible. But how do you do that in large neighborhoods or in big communities? So that was something that very famously, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was asked this question on numerous occasions. What about an Eruv in Brooklyn or in Flatbush in particular? And he said, no, it's a Rishus Harab and you can't do it. So that became a big obstacle. If Rabbi Feinstein says no, then how are you going to say yes? Actually, when it came to Manhattan, Manhattan had an Eruv since the first half of the 20th century. Really, it was really Rabbi Menachem Mendel Kasher in the 50s who started working towards creating an Eruv all around Manhattan. When they went to Rabbi Feinstein, they asked him theoretically his thoughts on an Eruv in Manhattan. He's like, you don't want my opinion. They didn't ask him if it's impermissible or forbidden, because if he said forbidden, they'd be stuck. So they discussed it conceptually. So Rabbi Feinstein never really poskined. He never decided about the Manhattan Eruv, but the Manhattan Eruv was built and relied on certain opinions, certain loopholes, certain leniencies that declared that the borough was not considered a biblical public domain. It didn't meet all of the various criteria. So this is something that has lots of different opinions and lots of different moving pieces. So if we're talking about that, you have to be able to enclose and have the proper enclosures and then join everybody together with this communal meal. How are you going to do that if you're not asking people, if there are people there who don't care about an Eruv? Right, this is becomes more and more complex. So in addition to the enclosing, in addition to the communal meal, it was deemed that if you have a place that has too many people, and you're not able to ask all of the people, then you could rent the city in a sense from the ruler of the city, and that way you basically then technically you have buy-in, you have permission to enclose in the city and join everybody together. And the criteria would be, as pointed out in source number 5, that if you have someone who's responsible for the needs of the city, who there's a sar, or hamamuna shelo, there's an officer, or there's a someone appointed by him. Vada shestiruso mahasar hahu meschiro v'likrito mahani. You can rent the city from that person. Shara yeshlo rishus lahoshiv anashav ukli milchamto b'vatei b'nei ha'ir b'shas milchama shalom midatam. Because he has permission. As an example, he is allowed to place troops anywhere in the city, and he can place troops in anybody's house. So if this person has the authority to go into people's houses whenever they want, they're responsible for the place. So therefore, when you build your Eruv, you have to be able to enclose the space. You have to be able to construct the proper enclosures. You have to be able to join everybody together. But to create the space, the landscape, that you have that permission, because you're not going to be able to talk to everybody, you have to then have what's called the schiras rishus. You have to rent from that person the authority that will then allow everyone to be joined together. And that was what this Brooklyn Eruv committee was doing with Mayor Adams. They were renting the space, they were renting the city. And so there are a whole host of questions, so what kind of authority are we talking about? If you notice in source number 5 that we said that someone is considered an authority figure if they have permission to place troops throughout the city, including in people's houses. Well, going back to our social studies lessons, what is one of the things that they were concerned about in the revolutionary times with armed forces, right? We wanted to be protected from having to quarter soldiers without our permission. This was part of the freedoms they were fighting for. So wait a second, what about today's Mayor Adams? Can he put authority, can he put military officials in people's houses? And so that became a question in modern times. Who do you go to in modern times? Who's responsible? Who's in control? Right, so who might you think is the relevant authority in our cities and communities? Right, does the mayor really fit the bill? So some wanted to suggest that you need federal authority. In a country like America, you have to go to the president. You have to get the president or his official. Others felt that, in a sense, it would be as long as it's someone who's a representative of the people. Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank, chief rabbi of Jerusalem, the first half of the 20th century, that he says that Koach HaMemshala Misura Biyad Moetzet HaMedina, right? It's the council of the people, council of state. You have someone who's a representative of the people. So essentially what Rabbi Frank is saying is that since in places that have elected officials, then it's the people who are the grantors of authority. And therefore, Rabbi Frank says, if you have rishus, if you have permission, like, for example, they're making this arrangement with Mayor Adams, right? And the article said, for how long are they making this arrangement for? 99 years. Well, how long is Mayor Adams' term? Not 99 years. Are they going to have to make another? Arrangement with the next mayor? Rabbi Frank says no. Essentially, you can make an arrangement with anyone who's a representative of the people for whatever terms that representative wants to make. And so now this Brooklyn VOD is set for the city for the next 99 years, regardless of how long Mayor Adams remains in office. And that essentially in democracies where it's the power of the people who elect, whoever that elected official is able to is able to grant that authority and create that enclosed space, that common space, which can then be enclosed properly by an Eruv. So Rabbi Chaim Jachter, who was a teacher and rabbi in New Jersey, who's also someone who is consulting and helping to build Eruvin throughout the United States. Some 50, 60 communities have utilized his expertise, including in Atlantic Beach. He describes that may not be good enough for some people, right? Again, what the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law says, you need someone who has control of all the houses. You need someone who's able to go into someone's house as needed. That's the only type of person who has the right type of authority, the right type of power. So he writes, thus it would seem that the president of the United States, as the head of the federal government, enjoys the halachic right to rent the entire country. Okay, man, you don't have to necessarily meet the president, but he can appoint his representatives. Often these days presidents have Jewish liaisons. Okay, so let the Jewish liaison meet the Jewish community and make this arrangement. Which rabbis would participate, a little bit tricky. But we do have a kind of a national religious type of situation in Israel. Indeed, in Israel, the chief rabbis rent the entire country from both the minister of the interior the Minister of Defense, and the National Head of Police. Interestingly, the rental was not made from the Prime Minister. However, when I presented this idea to Rav Schachter, he did not endorse the idea. Rav Schachter thought that unlike a mayor, chief of police, or county executive, the president has little to do with the day-to-day functioning of a system or a country, is thus not qualified or perhaps overqualified to conduct a Schirat Reshut. What does the president have to do with neighborhoods? We may add that even though Israel's chief rabbinate rents the entire country from the government, one cannot compare the US and Israel since the US is dramatically larger and has a dramatically greater population. Thus, the Israeli officials have much more involvement in the running of the area than the American president and even cabinet ministers. You need someone who has some control. You need someone who has some ability of dealing with local neighborhoods and houses. So Rabbi Schachter thought the president is way beyond the local concerns of constructing an Eruv and the like. It has to be someone who's much more local, who's much more of an authority figure locally. Now, interesting, Israel used government officials, but also police. And that's why many people, when constructing an Eruv, want to use someone who has control over the entire area. So they'll use police or fire department because those are individuals who sometimes have reason to go into houses as needed. The likelihood is the mayor is never going to burst into your house for any reason, but the police or fire departments may, should there become an issue. And so many people do it that way. Just one other point with regards to the Schirat Reshut. Generally speaking, some are concerned that, especially the way Eruvin are constructed, if you've ever seen an Eruv map, sometimes it crosses a street, sometimes it zigzags. It's not necessarily carry anywhere in a community, in a city or a town. And sometimes some of the places, municipality borders, maybe you're going from one into the other, right? Especially think of the 5 towns. 1 minute you're in this one minute you're in the other one. You can put 1 foot in both, right? So how do you avoid? How do you ensure that you've rented the community? You've rented the Schirat Reshut. You've rented permission to create this unified area when you have all these places near each other. So some say the best way to do it is with a county official, because county means any municipality in the county is covered. Maybe governor, it might be too big, but use a county official, and that will ensure that all of the municipal boundaries are covered. You don't have to worry about it because the county official, who has responsibility for county emergency services, county police, county, etc., that's the way to do it. And in fact, at least Rabbi Jachter reported that in Nassau County, that's what was done, for some of the Eruvin, and that happened in particular with the Atlantic Beach Eruv. That in 1988, a Schirat Reshut, an arrangement was made with the then Nassau County executive for 99 years. So anyone living in the Atlantic Beach Eruv doesn't have to worry about that expiring anytime soon, and we're all covered. Questions or comments? Yes.
It's just a little Atlantic Beach nostalgia that when not everyone in the community was, I'm sure you know the story, was really interested in having an Eruv. And so they couldn't do it through the shul. The rabbi wanted it. So Erwin Pizer, may he rest in peace, tried to help the rabbi out, and they went around Atlantic Beach in a boat with Rav Schachter to determine the Eruv. And the hotline was at my parents' house.
Well, I heard about certain documents being signed in the house. I think when
everything, and then there was an answering machine on the counter that you called to see if there was functioning or not. Right. But right. It was.
Yeah. So you definitely have a very personal connection to the Atlantic Beach Eruv. But it also raises a couple of interesting points in terms of, you talk about answering machines and checking Eruvin. I mean, growing up, we would always call the number, and today is Friday, June 16th, Parshas Shalach, the Eruv is up. And I remember, for when I moved to Manhattan, where I was actually very involved in the Eruv situation, the larger Manhattan Eruv and the West Side Eruv, and then they created the Mid-Manhattan Eruv. There's a whole bunch of moving pieces because, one of the things you could always be sure of is that whenever there's an Eruv, there's those who disagree with the Eruv, and those who have a different view as to whether it can be used or not used. And there are different views Sephardim have different requirements than Ashkenazim. It's, it's always the Eruv, which, as we're saying, is meant to bring people together, ends up having all sorts of, different opinions, whether it be Jews who don't want the Eruv, or Jews who don't hold from an Eruv. So, there too, I was very involved in the different mechanisms of the Manhattan Eruv. The Manhattan Eruv, Rabbi Adam Mintz has written a whole book on it, and there's a whole history of it. And I mentioned Rabbi Kasher in the 50s, and then Rabbi Lamb, and then Rabbi J.J. Schachter in the 80s tried to enhance it, and there were all types of different efforts. And I wasn't responsible for the message. I was responsible for the checkbook that paid for all the repairs, as you can imagine. But it was strange because it was a different culture. Many people weren't checking the Eruv. It wasn't just less observant, more observant. It was almost assumed that the Eruv was up. And sometimes the culture is that if the Eruv is known to be able to remain intact from week to week without any difficulty, that's when you don't have to check each week. And I think that especially as Eruvin have become more common and people are used to having them, and as some Eruvin have become more stable, the checking becomes less significant. And I think Manhattan, I think people just fell out of practice. It happened to be one of the major changes that took place in the Manhattan Eruv situation was the fact that the original Manhattan Eruv went out of service because it became impossible to maintain from week to week. Like, what good is an Eruv if it can't last for an entire week? If it's not lasting an entire week, what day is it going to go down? Maybe it's going to go down on the Saturday or the Friday. So how can, what you need in addition to the technical requirements of the enclosure and the joining together and having the permission, is you want an Eruv that's going to last. If you don't have any confidence that it's going to last, it's not really halachically helpful. Then you do have to check it constantly. And so it was, I think it was around 2005 that the original Manhattan Eruv in all of its different iterations, which was essentially enclosing all of Manhattan, where people were living from Washington Heights through Lower Manhattan, went out of use. And had been a West Side Eruv constructed, I think in the 80s, that was expanded. And slowly since then, they've been adding other neighborhoods in that. But currently the Manhattan Eruv is not as big as it used to be, but it's been expanded to include much of where Jews are living. But in terms of checking it, I don't know how often it's up, how often these repairs are like. I do know that Atlantic Beach Eruv is probably one of the most secure and reliable Eruvin possible because it doesn't really use wires anywhere. And it uses wires, and the Atlantic Beach Eruv uses wires in one place. And in one place, even if the wires are down, then it can probably rely upon the Long Beach Eruv or the Lido Beach Eruv. So there's kind of a lot of security. So if anyone is, thinking about, well, how come no one ever says anything about the Eruv? It's because the Eruv is basically always up, unless you hear otherwise. And then if it was down, we would be sure to, inform people. But for the most part, it's, that idea of having the answering machine and calling to check is important where the Eruv is not as stable and reliable, as opposed to places where it is, where it's essentially almost never down. And so that doesn't mean it's not checked. The checking goes on, but it does mean there's what to rely upon. Any other questions or comments? I just want to cover a couple other.
Rabbi, is it true that an Eruv does not necessarily have varying geographical dimensions? Correct?
Correct. Every community has its own quote unquote Eruv map.
Okay. I have a proposal, Rabbi.
Yeah.
We send the heads of the Jewish organizations to speak to President Biden and work out a methodology whereby the entire country is the Eruv. I think
good.
that would.
So that's a good point. I want to talk about that.
Thank you, Rabbi.
So first, in terms of using the president, so it did become an issue of using the president because we talk about going to the right official. So who is the right official? Is it the police chief? Is it the fire chief? Is it the mayor? Is it the governor? Is it the county executive? Well, there's one place in America that has a very convoluted system of who's in charge, and that place is Washington, D.C. There's a mayor, there's a police chief, there's a fire chief, but what is Washington, D.C.? It is, maybe there, when the Eruv was constructed in Washington, D.C., the question was, maybe there, since it's the capital of the United States, maybe there you do need a higher authority. And at the time, I believe it was during President Bush, the father of President Bush, when this was done, and an arrangement was made where President Bush issued a similar declaration to what we saw from Mayor Adams to cover the Washington, D.C. Eruv. That in particular because of the unique rules of who's in charge of Washington, D.C. But what about a whole country having an Eruv? So source number 8 for the Gemara in Eruvin, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef said that Rabbi Yochanan said, in Eretz Yisrael, one is not liable for carrying in the public domain. Right? Anywhere in Israel, it's not carrying in the public domain. Rav Dimi said, recited this halacha. Abaye said to Rav Dimi, what's the reason? If you say the law is because Eretz Yisrael is surrounded by the ladder of Tyre and the slope of Gadar, it doesn't mean there's a ladder, but it means that there's slopes and mountains, and you have physical boundaries that enclose it. Right, each formation may go over 10 head and breadths high and constantly valid partition. That Babylonia, which is also surrounded by the Euphrates River on one side and the Tigris River on the other side, should not be considered public domain either. Moreover, the entire world is also surrounded by the ocean, and therefore there should be no public domain anywhere. Right? So, is there this possibility? Does this possibility exist of an entire country being able to be enclosed? And so some of you may be thinking that there are people who talk about an island doesn't need an Eruv. And that concept emerges from this type of discussion. Talks about rivers and oceans surrounding things. It's not technically correct. That's not enough. And the commentaries on the Talmud talk about this. The Ritva in source number 9 quotes the Ramban that you can't have a huge Eruv because kol sheroa atzmo toch hamechitzos. You need to know that you're enclosed. Right? On Shabbos, you don't need to see the actual wires and strings or partitions, but you have to kind of at least recognize that you're within a geographic area that does have boundaries. But an entire country is too big. If the Eruv is the borders of a country, or the border, like say the United States, right? Person right in the middle of the United States doesn't really see themselves as enclosed by the United States. They see themselves enclosed by city limits, by state lines, by East Coast, West Coast, and the like. If you're in America, you don't really see yourself as being part of an Eruv. It's not enough to be an American citizen. You have to see yourself as being a resident of an enclosed enough area. And the U.S. would be way too big. The continents would be way too big for that. And that's what the Ramban, quoted by the Ritva, says about the idea of, let's say, in America being surrounded by an Eruv. Now, Tosfot points out that it's okay for there to be a very big Eruv, but lie on geographic boundaries on this level. And the rabbis say because these types of geographic boundaries are not really specific and definitive enough for it to work. Now, there's a whole discussion about, which takes us a little bit deeper into the laws of Eruv about the fact that people, pass through the boundaries. But even if you want to say, like we have, like New York City, right? The same thing that the Ritva said about a country, you could say about a city. If you're in the middle of, if you're in, Midtown Manhattan, do you see yourself as being enclosed by an Eruv? No, but at least you can have a very big Eruv, but you can't rely upon natural boundaries. And therefore, you might be able to rely upon an American Eruv with permission from the president if we had a wall all around America. But we're not going to have that. And although, some have pointed out that in Israel, there is a lot of boundaries. There is, there are, there's a fence in the north and there's a fence in the east. Generally speaking, as you approach the water, there's usually something that stops people from going straight directly into the water. For example, here in Atlantic Beach, the Eruv boundaries on the Eruv boundaries on the south. The south side is the north, south, east, west. West, east. The south side is the ocean, right? North side is the bay. Pretty much, you can't really walk into the ocean without crossing some form of fence, boardwalk, or the like. So, in Israel, you have border fences, land borders, and then you may have other boundaries or other enclosures at border borders. So maybe Israel, you could apply this to. You could say Israel's not quite as big, and Israel doesn't rely only on natural boundaries. You're also going to have fences. And some have said that that's part of some of the leniencies that get employed in Eruv is when you may, from a biblical level, be able to carry in the state of Israel. Remember, the rabbis, as we saw earlier, were stricter about where we cannot carry. But so that, I think, Al, is the problem with an American Eruv straight around the entire country, whether it's just too big for people to see themselves as being enclosed, or we don't really have enough of those constructed boundaries that would make it enclosed enough for it to be utilized. But it is certainly something that the Talmud and Jewish law entertained, that possibility of countries, continents, land masses all around the globe being enclosed already. One other interesting tidbit with regard to these laws, again, we talked about how you have to, there's a biblical public domain, there's a rabbinic public domain, you have to enclose the domain with the proper enclosures, you have to join people together, and to ensure that the people are joined together, you also have to have, to ensure that people are joined together, you have to also have that permission from the authorities. Well, if the area doesn't have permission from the authorities and there's a place that's excluded, how does that work? And so, for example, the question came up with regards to what about foreign embassies, right? Because I'm sure we've all encountered, whether it be in the news or in culture, right? Diplomatic immunity, right? If you have members of if you have foreigners who are here working for their country as diplomats, there's a certain status they have, and their embassies are considered the country that they come from, right? So United States has no jurisdiction on these kind of diplomatically protected places, or you can't apply the laws, right? It's always a big headline in New York City about all the parking tickets that all the diplomats accrue because you can't enforce, you can't make them pay anyway. Same thing applies. You can't go inside to a mission or an embassy because it's diplomatic immunity. So this, usually speaking, most of the time in suburbia, this doesn't emerge that often, but it does come up, and it did come up in the last, I guess 15, 20 years or so, maybe 20 years ago, in Englewood, New Jersey, because very famously Muammar Gaddafi had his ambassador living in Englewood, and it was in the neighborhood where Jews were living, and they wanted to have an Eruv, and they wanted to do this permission, the Skirat Reshut from the mayor or whomever they were using, but this area is excluded because the mayor has no jurisdiction over it. So Rabbi Jachter writes that that Professor Henkin, Professor Louis Henkin was a professor at Columbia. He was the son of a great rabbi named Rabbi Eliyahu Henkin, but he was a constitutional law scholar, international relations. And he explained that foreign embassies are not technically, it's the end of source number 7, are not technically defined as foreign territory. Under normal circumstances, local authorities grant the embassies a great deal of autonomy as a courtesy. Thus, police would not usually enter foreign embassies. However, in the case of serious emergencies, such as a fire, local officials do enter embassy property. Even if the foreign representatives protest such entrance, local authorities would not be able to do so if the embassy was truly foreign territory. If there's a fire, they're going in. If there's a 911 call, they're going in. And so therefore, even though there's diplomatic immunity and it's viewed as foreign territory, it doesn't interfere with the Eruv. Rabbi Jachter writes a couple of examples. I think he said that the Russian ambassador did or does have a home in Riverdale, and that was an issue there as well. And some people are strict and don't use the Eruv there because, or didn't at the time because of that. Like we said, there are always different opinions, and there's some who, without who are strict on who don't use an Eruv unless it's really a walled city. But this came up in Englewood, came up in Riverdale. It also is discussed with regards to Manhattan and the United Nations, because really the United Nations may really be a place that has it's not even from a legal perspective. And Rabbi Jactor quotes a couple of sources if you want to investigate further. What is the status of the UN building when it comes to it being part of being in America or not? But again, for the most part, since if something goes wrong, the police or fire department are getting in, so we don't really have to worry about it too much. But the possibilities emerge, especially when we're talking about that skirat rishut. So now I guess in New York City, or at least in this area of Brooklyn, they have a lease. And it's opened up a little bit of a conversation, so we're a little bit more familiar with how our Eruv works. Even if many of us are blessed not to have to worry about it, because we live in Eruv areas, and we live in Eruv areas that the Eruv is thankfully always up. Now we have a little bit of information as to how that Eruv becomes an Eruv and allowing us to carry on Shabbat.